We're previewing the NFL Combine, where there's almost too many wide receivers to talk about on today's Renner Ranks.
This is Renner Ranks, the ultimate NFL ranking show. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into today's episode of Renner Ranks, your go-to daily ranks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And a special shout out to those everydayers out there making Renner Ranks your first listen. And do not forget to subscribe, follow, like on YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I, of course, am Mike Renner, NFL draft analyst at Mike Renner _ on social media. And today's podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. We are previewing the NFL Combine offensive side of the football today, defensive side of the football on the next podcast. Without further ado, let's get right into it. At the quarterback position, where you can't actually get me to care about quarterback combines. There's no, as Eric Eager would say, former PFF data scientist, there's no signal to combine performances for quarterbacks. There is no data involved at any of the drills that is important when it translates to the NFL. The tape is. What they did on film is. So, no, I'm not going to do any of the preview categories I have prepared for the other positions, for the quarterback position. Although I will say, talked about it before, I do want to see if Joe Milton tests, how well he tests, because I'm intrigued by the possibility of him possibly switching to tight end, as I've said before, or just being an athlete on anywhere, man. The guy's a freak. So, yeah, quarterbacks, we're not going to do any of them. For the other positions, we're going to rank the top performer, who I think is going to come out top, and then some maybe honorable mentions for that. Guys who need good numbers, guys who maybe have necessarily question marks one way or the other, who need to go there and have good weeks for themselves. Guys who you shouldn't be worried if they put up bad numbers, or I'm not worried if they put up bad numbers. Now, not necessarily bad numbers. You should be worried if anyone puts up bad numbers, but not too worried if they don't test out like high-end athletes. If other guys are testing out better than them, don't worry. They have other ways that they win. And then the guys who have the best day 3 tools that I'll be looking at their combines intently this week. So I'll go to the running back position, where the top performer, I predict, will be Jalen Wright of Tennessee. The guy he had a run against Georgia where he left 2 top 100 picks in Kamari Lassiter, the Georgia corner, Javon Bullard, the Georgia safety. He left them in the dust. They were both ahead of him on the field. He blazed past them. They didn't even lay a hand on him. Jalen Wright, I expect somewhere, so he's 5'11", 210. I expect somewhere in the high 4.3s with him, maybe even mid 4.3s. If he goes anything above 4.45, I'll be very surprised. He's young, not even 21 years old yet, averaged 7.4 yards per carry this past season. He had 19 of his 136 rushing attempts go for 15-plus yards. He's the best size, speed freak in this running back class. Some other honorable mentions, though, on the bigger side of this running back class. I think Braylon Allen, the Wisconsin running back, I'd anticipate having a good week for himself. He'll come in the 240s. I know his top speed is pretty impressive at that size. I'm more curious to see his jumps, though, because I worry a little bit about his ability to stop and start at that size. And obviously, broad jump, vertical jump, oftentimes indicative of that. And then also throw out Audric Estime, the Notre Dame running back. He'll come in closer to the 220s, but at that size, has real deal breakaway speed. Very curious to see how he tests out in the linear explosion numbers. Now, some guys who need good numbers this week, guys who can answer some question marks. I have a couple that I'll be watching. First is Trey Benson from Florida State. Now, injury rechecks will be huge for him. He obviously had that gruesome, one of the worst knee injuries you can possibly have, ACL, MCL, meniscus, hamstring, way back as a freshman at Oregon back in 2020. Worked his way back from that to the past 2 years being probably the most impressive pure runner in this draft class. 124 broken tackles on 310 carries. He's 6'1", 223. I'm not sure he's going to blaze a 40, but I do think his broad jump and vertical jump, he's a guy who has that standstill explosiveness to his game. So I think if he puts up some good numbers, he could finish as my RB1 in this draft class because, again, not a great class. I'm also looking closely at Ray Davis, the Kentucky running back, who is not a breakaway speed guy. He averaged 4.9 yards per carry for his career. Out in the open field, he got hawked more often than you'd like for a starting running back in the NFL, but can put some of those questions to bed if he maybe comes in a little lighter because he was, 220 down at the Senior Bowl, a little lighter and maybe a little more spry. But I think he needs some good numbers to make his way into the top 120 sort of conversation in this draft. Now, to the guy that I'm not worried about if he puts up poor numbers, or let's say I'm worried about everyone if they put up poor numbers. The guy I'm not too worried about if he's not a quote unquote top performer the week that is, and it's Blake Corum, the Michigan running back, because of just his running style at 5'8", 213. He is a grinder. He's a between the tackles grinder. He is not a guy you're drafting for his long speed. It's kind of similar profile to like a Kyron Williams, right? Kyron Williams runs a 4.65 coming out of Notre Dame, falls down a lot in the draft because of it, but that's not his game. His game is short area quicks and explosiveness, that ability to hit the hole quickly and maximize those sort of concepts. That's why 45 touchdowns the past 2 seasons, because of his nose for finding the right gap. Now, I do worry, was he banged up this past year? How banged up was he? Because you saw his broken tackle numbers just plummet. 73 broken tackles in 2022, only 30 this past season, despite having even more carries this year. So I do think he has questions to answer, but even if he kind of comes in and has average numbers, I still am going to be a fan of his come draft day. Now on to the best day 3 tools. I think a couple guys really fit this bill for me. And now the running back position, I think a lot of these guys are day 3. Like guys we talked about, whether it's, Audric Estime, Braylon Allen, those guys could end up on day 3, and I don't think it would surprise people. But like true day 3 backs who I'm a fan of their tools, a couple guys. Jawar Jordan from Louisville, super undersized, 5'10", 185, already kind of a non-starter for a lot of roles in the NFL. But he may challenge for the fastest 40 in this running back class, and he gets out in the open field. He can really fly. 4.3 certainly in play for him. 6.2 yards per carry this past season, 1,123 rushing yards for Louisville. So like his tools as the late day 3 kind of explosive back down to the mix. And then Kamani Vidal, the Troy running back, who I've banged the table for numerous occasions. I think he should have good jump numbers. You see him really be able to crank it up to full speed quickly when he sees a gap, when he sees a hole. He's got that aspect to his game, and a similar body type in the 5'8 range, in the 2 teens range to a Blake Corum as well. And before we get to the wide receiver position, today's podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and more. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. All right, to wide receivers, where the top performers list, I mean, you could make a top 10 of just top performers at this wide receiver position. It's silly. Now, some of them won't test. Obviously, Marvin Harrison Jr. of Ohio State, Malik Neighbors of LSU. Those would be 2 top performers in any class. And unfortunately, won't be testing down at the combine. But with them out the picture, wide receiver 3, Rome Odunze from Washington, I fully expect to blow up the combine. Roman Wilson from Michigan, Now, I think Michigan's, when they make appearances on freaks lists in recent years, the Bruce Feldman freaks list, their numbers get gassed up a little bit, but his numbers also should be pretty darn good. A guy who will challenge the 3-cone record reportedly at the combine, a guy who could challenge the short shuttle record, and a guy who could blaze in the 4.3s as well. I think Javon Baker from USC is poised to really crush some of the jump numbers, run a good 40 as well. I think he is going to test extremely well. And then Tez Walker from North Carolina could be in the mix for some of the fastest. I expect his 40 broad jump to just be off the charts. And he was the guy, if you recall the Senior Bowl preview pod, or no, it was the Senior Bowl preview pod. It was the Daniel Jeremiah Top 50 pod, where I said, every year there's one that you see on Daniel Jeremiah's top 50 and you're like, that guy's way too high. He was 26th on the top 50. His latest update dropped out of the top 50 entirely. So called that one. Sometimes, I think he was one of only 3 guys that dropped out of the top 50 and the only one to drop more than 8 spots, and he dropped like 25 spots. So sometimes you just know those things, but a lot of top performers. I mean, I think like Xavier Leggett is going to blow up the South Carolina wide receiver. Freudian slip there with his build at 6'1", 228. Almost called him running back, but I think he's going to go have a real nice 40 vert, broad, those sort of things. Curious to see if he runs a 3-cone, but nowadays, man, I hate that it's such a manicured process by these agents that if a guy doesn't do something well, they just never run it. If a guy has a bad 3-cone time, he's just never going to do it, unfortunately. And then you get to have that imagination in your head of, was it going to be, a 7.2 3-cone where, for a wide receiver, it's not untenable, or was it like a 7.8 where you're like, oh my gosh, this guy turns like a Mack truck. So we don't get to see those anymore, though, unfortunately. Now, on to some guys who need some good numbers this week at the combine, guys who need to answer, in my opinion, some question marks about their athleticism. And the first one is Keon Coleman from Florida State. Now, I think he's more than athletic enough to still produce in the NFL at a high level, but I do worry about his speed. What kind of long speed does he really have? Because, we just didn't get to see it, unfortunately, in this Florida State offense. Only 16 of his 50 catches this past season came 10-plus yards down the football field. Now, how many 6'4", 215-pound wide receivers return punts that you can remember, like Keon Coleman did? Not a lot, which is one of the things I keep going back to, is like there is dynamism there that's just been untapped in his game and was untapped in this Florida State offense. And he's still young. Turns 21 in May. He'll be 20 on draft day. Won't even get to celebrate properly getting drafted in what I think should be the first round. Now, honorable mention. I do have to laugh, though, going back to Keon Coleman just for a second. Do you guys remember when Booger McFarland tweeted out that Keon Coleman's closer to Marvin Harris, to wide receiver 1, than to Marvin Harrison than a lot of people want to admit in like mid-season this past year? Do you guys remember that? Oof. When people who don't follow draft try to weigh in on draft takes, it can be funny. That one was obscene. All right. Honorable mention. I think Adonai Mitchell needs a big week too. Now, a lot of guys need big weeks. When you have a crowded class like wide receivers, you're probably going to lean towards the better athletes, right? If you have similar grades on guys. But I think Adonai Mitchell, I expect him to jump well at minimum. You see that in his game. You see that in him high pointing. But I did think that when he really had to stride away, when he stacked corners and really had to stride away, I thought he struggled more than, the other bigger wide receivers in this draft class. Whether it's, now we did get to see Keon Coleman do that ton, so I'm not going to say Coleman, but Brian Thomas Jr., I thought definitely had another gear that Adonai Mitchell didn't. I thought Rome Odunze had another gear. I thought Marvin Harrison Jr. had another gear. So is Mitchell, I think anything in the 4.4s would be a great time for him, but I wouldn't be surprised if he goes high 4.5s coming out of Texas. Now, the don't worry if they don't light it on fire prospect in this wide receiver class, to me, is Jalen Polk from Washington. I'm not going to say I don't care at all if he doesn't test well, but he's 6'2", 204. He's like a lot of his strengths, weaknesses are similar to like Puka Nakua's last year coming out of BYU. And I'm not going to say he's going to be Puka Nakua, but he's the type of guy that can succeed despite average athletic tools because he's so skilled for the position. He's so strong for the position and productive. 69 catches, 1,159 yards, 9 touchdowns, 15 broken tackles, only a 5.3% career drop rate. He's just a guy you want in the fold. Maybe never going to be a number one. Maybe never going to be a go-to guy in an offense, but a guy with a really high floor that, you know, if Puka ran the 4.6s, if he runs a low 4.6, it's not going to all of a sudden have me dropping him to the day 3, right? I'm not that worried about Jalen Polk. Now, best day 3 tools at the wide receiver position. I'll preface this by saying projects at wide receiver are not the same as projects at other position. There are not a lot of guys who fall to day 3 who run like 4.3s with 40-inch verticals, 6'10" wingspans that you're like, okay, I'll just coach them up how to run routes and catch footballs. That doesn't happen, right? I think wide receiver is not a project position. The day 3 productive guys at wide receiver, more often than not, are just your kind of overlooked slot wide receivers. They're the guys that actually are the worst athletes. We just talked about with Puka Nakua, or like Dontavion Wicks last year out of Virginia, who also ran the 4.6s, or Amon-Ra St. Brown coming out of USC, who didn't test anything special, but falls to day 3 and is highly productive. Why? Because it's the guys that are skilled who fall to day 3 for other reasons who then be productive at that point. So to me, the best day 3 tools in this class is a guy in Malik Washington out of Virginia who's going to fall to day 3 because he's 5'8". Even though he's got a longer wingspan than Roman Wilson from Michigan in this class, who's probably going to be a top 2-round pick, Chris Olave, who was a top 15 pick, and Jaden Reed, who was one of the most productive rookie wide receivers last year. He's got over a 6-foot wingspan at 5'8". He's solidly built, almost 190 pounds. He's like a real mini Debo Samuel looking guy. I know Malachi Corley's gotten the mini Debo, but like this is actually a mini Debo. He's super strong at that size. Only 2.5% career drop rate. Highly skilled. Now, will he? I expect his jumps, change direction drills to go really well. I don't think his long speed's anything special. That's why he's going to, again, likely fall to day 3. But he is right up there as a route runner with pretty much, darn near anyone else in this draft class. Maybe throw Marvin Harrison out of this. But he can get open, haul in passes outside his frame, and if he falls to day 3, I think he's going to be a productive wide receiver in the NFL still. Because again, wingspan's more important than pure height at wide receiver for the vast majority of passes that you have to haul in. So, Malik Washington, in my opinion, your best day 3 tools at the wide receiver position. All right, before we get to tight ends, today's podcast is brought to you by BetterHelp. What's the first thing you do if you had an extra hour in your day? A lot of us spend our lives wishing we had more time. The question is, time for what? If time was unlimited, how would you use it? The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and to make it a priority. Therapy can help you find what matters to you so that you can do more of it. If you're thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOn today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp.com/LockedOn. All right, tight ends, where it's not a super intriguing class by any means, but the top performer, I think it's going to be JT Sanders, the Texas tight end, third-year guy coming out, only 20 years old, 45 catches, 682 yards, 15.2 yards per catch this past season. That's a very high number for tight ends because the guy can cook. The guy has some real deal speed to him. Now, I am curious to see his change direction drills. That's where my questions about him revolve. But good hands, didn't drop a single pass this season, and great speed. Expect him to be the top performer there. Now, guys who need good numbers. I think it's the to me, the two undersized guys. I think Brock Bowers from Georgia, I believe he'll be a top performer, right up there with Ja'Van Sanders. But I do worry, again, size. He is skinny. Was in the 230s to start his career. Listed at 240 this last year. Was he actually? Who knows? Definitely looks small, though, for a tight end. I think not only does he need a good weight, and a good weight's 245 would be a good weight for him. He's never going to be a 260 tight end, right? That's understood with him. But I think getting into that range, the low to mid 240s, while maintaining his athleticism, because he had a 40-inch vert coming out of high school, 4.5, 140. That's not in question. It's just the weight plus the numbers that I think is in question with him. And similarly with Dallin Holker, the Colorado State tight end, who was almost a glorified wide receiver for Colorado State, 6'5", 235. Is he just a wide receiver, or can he put on some mass in his frame and still maintain some athleticism? So those are two guys I think that need good numbers. The guy I'm thinking, if he doesn't test well, I'm not too worried, and I don't expect him to test well, is Cade Stover out of Ohio State, 6'4", 251. He's a bruiser. He is your inline guy. 41 catches, 576 yards, 8 broken tackles. He's the guy that you're not going to send vertically and expect to win. He's a guy who can win underneath, win intermediate, maybe take a 8-yard hitch, get the 3 more yards to get the first down fairly consistently. But a reliable dude, no drops this past season. So fan of his game, and if he comes out and runs a 4.8, I'm not going to become necessarily less a fan of his game. I see him still as like an early day 3 type. But, if he does run a little faster, if he goes, I think a fast time for him would be a 4.7. If he does, I think he's a top 100 player in this class. But if he doesn't, again, not too worried about that. Best day 3 tools at tight end. There's 2 guys that I'm looking at to watch their testing. One's Tanner McLaughlin, the Arizona tight end, who started his career off at wide receiver, kept bulking up, still moves like a wide receiver. Talked about him on the Senior Bowl preview pod, ended up not actually playing that week, but hopefully he puts up numbers next week. And then Theo Johnson from Penn State, a guy who was one of the guys who showed out at the Senior Bowl. Now, he can really put a stamp on his pre-draft process with some good testing. But another guy who has more prototypical size, all-around athleticism. I think he should be close to one of the top performers. You just see a good all-around athlete when you watch his tape. All right, let's move on to offensive tackles, where top performer, there's going to be a lot of them, right? The one who sticks out is probably Kingsley Suamataia, the BYU offensive tackle. At 6'6", 315, he could just fly. I mean, he may run 4.8s at that size. Played right tackle in 2022, left tackle this past season. I expect his whole testing to be just primo. But then after him, Olu Fashanu of Penn State, I expect to test off the charts. Tyler Guyton from Oklahoma, I would expect to test extremely well. Amarius Mims from Georgia. J.C. Latham, I think his bench press numbers are going to be stupid. So a lot of guys in that mix. The guys who need good numbers, I actually think, so obviously, Joe Alt has some questions to answer, but I'm more interested, the guys who I think need good numbers are the 2 top probably projects just based off of their tape. And that's Amarius Mims from Georgia, in terms of you haven't seen a ton of them. 6'7", 340, build as a freak. When that's the case, when you're getting drafted highly because of your traits, you better show out in that regard. And then the other one's Blake Fisher from Notre Dame, a guy who declared early as a true junior coming out of Notre Dame. I think to make himself a top 100 selection, he needs to test highly across the board. 5-star coming out of high school, all that pedigree, but just never really developed. So those are the guys I'm more looking at. I think need good numbers. The guy that I'm not worried if he doesn't put up great numbers. Obviously, again, Joe Alt's in that mix, but the one after that, I think, is Patrick Paul from Houston, because that's not how he wins. Only 9 pressures allowed on 496 pass blocking snaps in the Big 12 this past season, one of the best pass protectors in college football. But he wins because he's 6'7", 333 with 36 1/4 inch arms, man. He wins out of sheer size. Sheer size and physicality that just you can't replicate in pass rush. So while he may not be the most fleet of foot and don't expect him to test the most fleet of foot, I still think he can be a productive tackle in the NFL despite that. All right, best day 3 tools in the staff class. To me, it's Brandon Coleman from TCU. He's played left tackle, right tackle, left guard over the course of his TCU career. 6'4", 316 with 34 and a quarter inch arms. So he may be seen as a guard by some because of that height. I think he can still play tackle, but I watched this guy climb to the second level, and it's just shot out of a cannon. So he should test exceedingly well. And I do think I like his tape more than like a Blake Fisher out of Notre Dame in terms of developmental potential. But yeah, I mean, he obviously may not even end up on day 3 if he really blows up the combine because of that. I quickly threw this interior line class because if there's any position on the football field where combine testing is the least important after obviously quarterback that we discussed, it is interior offensive line. You obviously want guys who trend towards more fleet of foot, better athletes. That's not necessarily a prerequisite for high-end performance at the next level there, especially. So top performer, I'll throw out Christian Haynes from UConn. I've banged the table for him a number of times throughout this pre-draft process. 6'2", 318, 33 and 7/8 inch arms. The guy can fly too. I expect him to test well just any drill. Like he really just moves exceedingly well. Now, Cooper Beebe, Kent State offensive tackle. He's got some explosiveness to him and some strength. I think his numbers in those regards should be really nice as well. Jackson Powers Johnson, I would expect to be a top performer also. A guy who needs some good numbers that I'm a little worried about based off his tape is Christian Mahogany from Boston College. If you'll recall, so he's 6'3", 322. It's a fifth-year guy. He was a guy getting discussed as maybe like the top guard prospect in the 2023 draft class heading into 2022. Tears his ACL, though, unfortunately, after a breakout 2021 campaign in the offseason before 2022. Misses the whole season. Comes back this year. I just didn't think I saw the same mobility in him. I didn't see high-end NFL guard mobility to hang his hat on. I think a lot of people see him as a day 3 guy now because of that. But again, ACLs, not everyone has the same sort of timeline in how they recover from them. Hopefully he tests well at the combine to sort of alleviate some of those concerns. I am not worried if he doesn't test great. And now again, interior offensive line, I'm not worried too much if anyone doesn't test great. But I think Cedric Van Pran from Georgia is one where he's a power center. He's a phone booth center. He's not a guy that you're expecting to play out in the move. That's already known from his tape. And I have him as a top 100 player because of that, obviously for certain schemes. But if he doesn't, if he runs a 5.3 and doesn't light the world on fire, I'm not even going to bat an eye, right? Travis Frederick had some of the worst testing ever coming out of Wisconsin for the center position. He ran the slowest 40 of anyone at the combine that year. And he was the best there in the NFL for a good portion of his career. So again, not too worried there. Best day 3 tools in this interior offensive line class to me, it's Layden Robinson, the Texas A&M guard. He was another guy, kind of like Mahogany, where after his 2021 season, people expected this guy to be a top 50 pick at guard. He's 6'4", 315. Now in his 5th year, though, he never really developed as a pass protector. The explosiveness, though, the body type is all still there to be a high-end guard at the next level. Just a guy who needs some development to his game. So there you have it. Your offensive combine preview. Defense will be tomorrow, or I guess today, since I'm releasing them on the same day. Teams will be the next episode. There you go. Until then, though, you've been listening to Renner Ranks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.